So I'll talk to you all in the back. Can everybody hear me well? Is the audio set up? Yeah? Okay, we're good. We're good. Awesome. And thank you for all of you that look to brave the weather. I see a few clouds up there. If it starts raining, just run away again. That's totally fine. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rami Ismail. I'm an independent game developer, and I am best known as the co-founder of indie studio Vlaambeer, which is a studio that was founded back in 2010. We're best known for games such as Super Crate Box, Ridiculous Fishing, Nuclear Throne, and Luftrausers. I ran that studio for about 10 years, and at Vlaambeer, I was the programmer, I was the business person, and I did a lot of the management and marketing. Then after that, and sort of at the same time, I also became a consultant. So I help indie studios figure their shit out. I help them try to make good games in good ways with good people. And so I do both studio and project advisory. I'll join teams to help them figure out how to ship their game. I do what we call finishing production, where I try to get a game across the finish line. But I also just work with teams for several years on trying to get their game done and out in good ways. I created tool sets such as Presskit, which is the industry standard Presskit system. I write a newsletter called Leveling the Playing Field, which is a newsletter that is free with tips on marketing, managing, designing, and running teams. I am the organizer of GameDev.world, which is a octolingual games conference. I run the Global Games Fund, which is a fund for pre-production and pre-prototype games made in territories around the world that are not Northwestern Europe, North America, New Zealand, or Australia. I am a board member of the International Game Developers Association, and I am the government's relation person for the Dutch Games Association, and I'm an ambassador for Safe in Our World Enable Gamers. The reason I tell you all these things is just to give you a bit of a background on who I am and kind of how weird my career has been. I've been all the way from a solo programmer doing Flash games to working with some of the largest platforms out there on defining their indie strategy. I've run teams that are 2 people. I've run teams that are 100 people, or helped run teams that are 100 people. So as I've gone through my career, I've just kind of done a lot of weird stuff. And so I was asked to do a talk about leadership. And leadership is a weird topic in the games industry because it's one of the most fundamental things of any team, is that a team needs leadership. But it's really hard for people to sort of be a good leader. It's really hard for people to recognize good leadership. It's really easy to be a bad lead, and it's really easy to recognize bad leadership. So just to be entirely clear, for this talk, what we're going to do is we're going to keep it a little bit at a more of an intro level. Obviously, we'll discuss some more advanced things. But if you have questions at the end of this talk, that will be a good place to ask any question, no matter how advanced or complicated it is. The reason I do that is because generally in the games industry, we kind of suck at leadership. It's not really a secret that we have a leadership problem. And if you go into any post-mortem for any major game whatsoever, recently the Suicide Squad game, but other games as well, if you read their post-mortems, if you read the articles about what happened with that game, you'll see lots of discussions of bad leadership, late pivots, unreliable goals and constraints. And I think that's a result of us just not really talking about leadership as its own skill, as its own discipline. What we see instead in games is that what we keep doing over and over is we'll take really good craftspeople, and instead of promoting them to be better craftspeople, we promote them away from their craft into a position of leadership. So our best artist goes from being a great artist delivering great work to being a very mediocre kind of management person because they're just not a manager. They don't want to be a manager. They don't want to be a leader. They don't want to be doing these things. They want to make beautiful art. So even though the industry is getting a little better at that now, we now see promotional tracks that go into leadership and then another one that goes into being a better craftsperson. This still is a majority of the leadership in the games industry right now are people that don't want to lead or people that don't know how to lead. And that creates a bit of an iffy situation. So to zoom it out all the way, and before we start, what does leadership mean in a general context? So I Googled this one. It said, leadership is the ability of an individual or a group of people to influence and guide followers or members of an organization, society, or team. And it continued with, an effective leader has the following characteristics: self-confidence, strong communication and management skills, creative and innovative thinking, perseverance, willingness to take risks, open to change, level-headed, and reactiveness in times of crisis. And this is the Google definition of, this came from some blog that really likes leaders. I fairly strongly disagree with a lot of that. I think, in fact, one of the biggest problems that we see for leadership is that it's often seen as a position of fame, a position of power, and a position of influence. But that's not really how leadership should work. Everybody has heard the idea, well, not everybody, but most people have heard this idea that when a team does well, praise should flow down and responsibility should flow up. It's a very basic idea. If you are the team lead of a team and you win an award, you go on stage and you say, oh, you know, it was not just me. There was an entire team that won this award. If the game does poorly, you take full responsibility. That's how leadership should work. But people that aren't in leadership or that are looking up at leadership very often think that this is a place where they get to go, I want to make a game about cars that go real fast and do loopings, so now everybody has to make a game about cars that do loopings. Which might be a good game. I'm not saying that's not a good game, but that's not quite what leadership is. Good leadership in complex organization is actually a position of facilitation. It's how to get a thing done. Thing undefined, done defined, right? And it's a position of decision making. You're the one where the buck stops. So the call you make is the call, which is a little terrifying, but I like to explain leadership to people that aren't leaders, that I have to train to be leaders. I try to explain them that good leadership is more like a process as a person. You're still a human. You still have your opinions. You still have, the things you believe, the things you think, and obviously they're going to affect how you decide things. But I like to think of leadership as a process and as a person, and the reason I like to think of it is that processes have a few very good characteristics that I think you share with good leadership, which is they're reliable, they're dependable, and they're trustworthy. If something goes into the process and the process works the way you expect, something will go in, something will come out, and you can somewhat understand what those are. So if you are just a process as a person, does that mean you have does that mean you have nothing to add, nothing to say? No, of course not. Like I said, you're still a person, you still have what you want. But leadership is not about choosing what you want, it's about figuring out how you can facilitate the best outcome for everyone. So far more of a process than a dictator, far more of a facilitating role than a power position. So let's talk about leadership, and let's talk a bit about why so many game studios mess it up. And to do that, I'm going to go over a few things that game studios in general don't really get right, and especially this applies to indie studios. It applies to smaller ones more than larger ones, but a lot of these things just sort of expand upwards anyway, because if you start as a small studio with all these issues, as you grow, you're still going to have these issues. They're just going to take different shapes, usually more dangerous shape to your studio. So let's start with hierarchy. I still think that there's never been anything more damaging to the games industry than an article that Valve wrote in 2014 about flat hierarchy. Valve has a flat hierarchy, so there's no decision makers. Apparently it's a fully democratic system, and that apparently works well. Talking to people at Valve, it doesn't work that well, and also it's weird that it's a flat hierarchy, but everybody knows Gabe Newell is in charge, so I don't know how you mix those two things, but it's a flat hierarchy with Gabe. Unique system. Flat hierarchy effectively means that there's no real decision-making power within Valve. If you want to do something, you do it by forming coalitions, by getting people together, which turns all decision-making at Valve into a horrifying high school backstabbing sequence of politics and favoritism. A lot of people at Valve will tell you it's not the best way of doing things. I believe every creative project needs two leaders, a creative leader and a production leader. And they have distinct roles within their project. The creative leader is the person who protects the game. They protect the idea that this game has to be good and interesting, that it has to be creative. They protect the creative vision of what the game is supposed to be. That means that they set sort of the direction of the game, they set the tone of the game, they set the tone of development, they set the goals, the scope, the size, but across from them is a production leader. That could be a lead producer, an executive producer, a project manager, or no matter what you call it, we still haven't figured out how to call jobs in the games industry. But with the production person, I mean they're the person who's in charge of making sure the game gets shipped, that it gets out there, that it gets finished, that it's on budget, that it's on time, and that when it needs to be done, it goes out to people so that it can start making money. To abstract that a bit away from video games and to make that more of a creative statement, I would like to say that the creative lead sets the goals of the project, and the production lead sets the constraints of the project. And so these two phrases are incredibly important, and we'll get back to some of those later. But the base idea of leadership is that there are a few things that need to be abundantly clear to your team at any given point. The first one is, what is the goal of what we're doing? And the second one is, what are our constraints? So what should we achieve, and within which line should we do it? So if I tell you, okay, make a Super Mario clone, right? Then the first question you might wonder is, how long do I have, right? Or you might wonder, a more creative question, 2D or 3D Mario. But if I just give you that goal, and then in 35 seconds I go, are you done yet? You're going to feel a little betrayed, because that doesn't feel like a reasonable constraint. Most people in the games industry are focused on one or the other. Sort of as a person, they're focused on one or the other. And you'll find that the different types of personalities in games tend to focus one way or the other. The creative folks tend to focus more on the goals, and the more production-minded folks tend to focus more on the constraints. If your first response to make a Mario game, if your first response was, when do you want it, you're probably more of a production-minded person. If your question was anything else, you're probably more of a creative person. The reality is that the best way games get made is if these two things, the goals and the constraints, or the creative and the production leader, create friction. Friction between the two forces. You want somebody who wants the game to be the best version of the game possible, and they should not make concessions for anything. Their job is to only and exclusively make the best game they can possibly make. To get their team aligned, to get things going, to experiment as much as they can, to improve as much as they can, to create the best version of the game they can possibly make. Now, the production person needs to not give a shit about any of that. The production person has one job and one job only, which is the milestone is in 2 months. Is it going to be done? What you create from that, if everybody keeps to their own corner, is you create a friction that allows for the best possible outcome. Because on the creative side, people will push as much as possible to create the best game possible. On the production side, they will put on the brakes as much as needed to make sure it ships on time. The best outcome comes from these two people never stepping over their line. If your creative director is making a decision based on what they think production needs, the better thing to do is to have this creative leader talk to production. And have them go, okay, no, actually, we can do this, or maybe you have that, or these resources are available. If your production person starts wondering about the quality of the game, you're creating a situation where they might make decisions that might not be the best for the game because they're now overstepping into the creative. What I'm trying to say is that what we need, above all, in leadership is that we create clear systems of hierarchy and responsibility. So in that previous example, we very clearly said, okay, goals are on the creative side, constraints are on the production side. I don't actually care if you do it exactly that way. I believe that's the best way, but I've also been proven wrong a number of times in my life, and I'm very okay with being wrong. What I'm saying is, if I explain it this way to a team, and I say, okay, you're the creative director and you're the producer, now everybody knows what that means. And what that means is that when somebody has a question, they go to the right person. It also means that if something goes wrong, we know which person to talk to. If you go lower in the hierarchy, what you normally get is you get discipline leads. So you might get yourself an art director, engineering director, you might get yourself a design director, depending on how big the team is. With those, very similarly, they need to be setting these same goals within their department. They need goals and constraints. We need this done in this way by that time. And if these things are unclear, what you get is chaos. Because people that are not leaders tend to perform well when there's order. When there is a clear set of goals and constraints and they're reliable. They don't change, they don't shift, they don't make changes. So creating these systems really helps. For leads, it is also important to understand that ultimately whatever happens in any team you lead is your responsibility. So if you're at Vlaambeer, at my old studio, like I said, I was usually in charge of code and management and business and all those things. My co-founder back at Vlaambeer in the early days, Jan-Willem Nijman, was our design lead. And we once had a 3-day discussion about the shape of clouds. Because the way Jan-Willem wanted clouds in Luftrausers was he wanted them inspired by Chinese water painting clouds, which look kind of like that kind of shape, like sort of like a straight line with like half circles and then backwards. He thought they were beautiful. I think they're cool. I wanted them to look like clouds. Because I thought we were not making a Chinese water painting game, we were making a game about flying airplanes, and I wanted the clouds to look like clouds. And so we actually ended up having a 3-day argument about this, in which on the first day we really got into a fight, and we both went home kind of angry and kind of like disappointed because we both felt like we were being very reasonable in what we wanted. And then on the second day, we kind of did the we tried not to talk about it, but then ended up talking about it like every 2 hours or so. And on the third day, I went to Jan-Willem and I said, like, listen, the thing is, the clouds make it look like, the Chinese ones, they look like wind. They don't have a fill shape, they're just lines. They look like wind. And he looked at me and was like, well, fuck. Okay, we'll do your clouds. Here's the thing, ultimately, he was the design director. So if it turned out that the Chinese water painting clouds had been better, that was his fault, that he went with my decision. Oh, hello. Ultimately, he was in charge of how the game looked. So even though he took my input and he agreed with my input, that's still his responsibility. But it is a sign of good leadership. Maybe not the 1 day of fighting and 1 day of like trying to talk about it, but also we were 21. But that experience, that conversation to me has really led to this idea that there should always be somebody in charge, because I was once called into a studio that released their first hit game. They had done their first game straight out of school. They were a team of 8. They had shipped a hit game, and they had been working together for years on this game, on this one hit game. They shipped their game, and they called me a few months later, and they said, Rami, we need you to come in. I'm like, okay. So I went to the studio, and I sat down with the team, and I asked them, what's up? And they're like, well, you know how we're a team of 8? I'm like, yeah. They're like, well, 4 of us think we should do game A, and 4 of us think we should do game B, and we can't figure it out. And it's been 2 months now, and we've been arguing, and we've been discussing, and we've been fighting, but the thing we've not been doing is we've not been making a video game. And for now, it's fine, because our first game is doing really well, but we're just really not happy at work anymore. So I asked them, well, who's in charge of this decision? And they're like, well, that's the problem. We were going to pick that after our first game. But at that point, what happened is the studio split into 2. Group A, Group B. Group A wanted to make game A, Group B wanted to make game B. And now the decision of who was going to be the director of that creative decision was automatically an election for which game they were going to make. And since the studio was split in 2, it led to a 4-4 vote. Every team had voted for their own strongest leadership person. So these are systems of hierarchy of responsibility. Is that crackle or is that rain? It's not rain, is it? Okay, good. Creating that system of responsibility when it is needed will always backfire. These are systems you create up front, similarly to why we sign contracts before we start working together. When we make the contract, we're still friends. We still like each other. We still have each other's best interest at heart. When the contract is necessary, by definition, we're not friends, because that's why we need the contract. So for these clear systems, one of the exercises that I very often do is called a little weird. It's called a RACI chart, R-A-C-I. And it just is a system in which you divide your people, your team, and your decisions into people that are responsible, accountable, consultant, or informed. Basically, you say, who does the work? Who is responsible for the work? Who do we ask about the work? And who do we tell about the work? And even though it sounds a little crazy to do something like that, same thing is true. These are the kind of decisions you want to have before they become a problem. And because if there is a lack of hierarchy, what you can get is a hit game studio shutting down because they can't figure out what their second game is. And in the example of my friends, luckily, I managed to come in and they allowed me to be the 9th vote. So I picked their second game, which was kind of a crazy thing to do, but it allowed me to select who was going to be the lead, and then they trusted me enough to make that call. That studio is still around making games. But the fact that they had to call out an outside person to save their studio from falling apart should be terrifying to you. Because the last thing you want is ship a hit game and then have your team fall apart. Although, you know, last thing you want is not shipping a hit game, I guess. But let's talk about creative clarity. Creating clarity, because that is obviously sort of the goal of setting this hierarchy, is this clarity to make sure that people understand what's happening. And I think the most important thing there is creating reliable methods of communication. How do we talk to each other? And this is an exercise I do very often, but one of the biggest problems with game development is that game development is not one thing. Game development is many things. It's art, it's programming, it's design, it's psychology, it's data analysis, it is everything. Everything goes into games. Obviously, play, games, game design. But the way we talk about games, the way we discuss games in meetings, in talks, in conversation, is the same way I'm talking to you now. Words. Words are really good and really bad. Because the way words work on a psychological level is I say words, and then you take what you think the words mean and create a model around that, right? So if I say, I want to make a level that feels sunny, what does that look like? What does sunny look like? I do this exercise frequently with, you know, what, if I was to give you a word, and I ask any of you to tell me the first word that comes to mind, right? I don't know if any of you have seen more of my talks, I might have done this exercise with you before, but I'm still going to ask, and I'm going to use the same example as always, which the word sun, right? A sunny level. So let's go with the word sun. What is the first word that comes to mind when you think of the sun? If anybody wants to try, yeah, go ahead. Shadow. Who else had shadow, just by raise of hands? Everybody? I see one other person, two other people had shadow. Anybody else? Happy. Who else had happy? Two other people, happy sun, three other people, happy sun. Okay. Does anybody think they have a word that gets about 10% of the attendees? Okay, go for it. Heat. Who else had heat? 3, 4 people. Okay, anybody else? 10% of the room. Beach. Beach. Who else had beach? One other person. Anybody, 10%. 10% of the room. So like 20 people, 15 people. Yeah, go. Using sun for sun. Who else had the word sun in response to what word do you think of with sun? You must be programmers. Cool. Anybody 10%? Okay, I'll try one more. You over there. Star. You're the only one who had star. Words are very powerful, but very fallible. It's very easy to think that we agree about something, because when I say the word sun, you might think, I know what he's talking about. I was thinking of Egypt. I'm half Egyptian. So for me, summer was vacation to Egypt. So when you ask me to do a sunny level, I think of smoggy Cairo. I don't think of a beach. I don't think of a forest. I don't think of water. I don't think of stars. I think of smog. That's what was come to mind when I talk about sun. So if I told you make a sunny level and you came back with a beautiful beach thing, I would go like, nah, that's not quite what I was thinking. And we just wasted 2 weeks of work, right? So When it comes to game development, one of the things I always teach people is very simple. Try to communicate in the language of the discipline that you're talking to. So if you're going to be talking to an artist, please just draw, find images, search, Google, whatever you do to create something that somebody can look at, to get the colors, the vibe, whatever it is, do that. If you're going to be talking to a musician, please don't try to describe sound. Just make the sound. You have a mouth, it produces sound, use that, and make the sound, right? This is a little too, and I want more like, and now the sound designer can look at it and go like, oh yeah, I gotcha. And instead of having to do 5 different versions of that to figure out what I think, now it's immediately clear, right? And the reason we do that is because each of these disciplines is usually a different type of thinking. When I joked earlier that the 2 people that picked sun in response to sun were probably programmers, programmers are very logical. If I say, okay, what do you think of with sun? Well, sun. That sounds like a programmer response to me. That sounds like a programmer's joke. Now, not all programmers are the same. The same thing, not all designers, not all artists, not all. But in general, different people in the industry have different ways of looking at the world, different ways of thinking, grow up in similar communities with similar interests. Artists all went to DeviantArt when they were 14, if they were from my generation. So we know there's a little bit of DeviantArt in the background of their mind somewhere. Whether that's good or bad, I'll leave that up for discussion amongst the audience, but we know that's there, right? So creating these methods of communication to overcome all these differences between the type of people that we are, the way we think, the specificities of the discipline is incredibly important. And clarity then is a result of clear goals. When I say I don't want to, I want to, that is a very clear goal. I want to. If you come back to me with to, that's not it. That's not what I wanted, right? That clarity creates a way to say, okay, I have an idea, I hear you, right? If the sound designer that comes back to me is like, I hear the thing, but what if we're like, more like, I can be like, okay, yeah, sure, let's try that, right? Or I can say, no, listen, I really want this specific thing. Having that clarity of goal creates safety. And safety is one of the most important things you can offer as a leader. Constraints then is when do I need it? How do I want it? Do I want this as a WAV file? When does it need to be done? Usually that's set in some sort of document or a tech spec or something like that. And then finally, consistency in applying them. Because if you're not consistent with applying these kind of rules, what you get is you get this weird situation where nobody quite knows what it means. If I say, no, I want to, and then we come back and 2 weeks later everybody's listening and it's not that at all, then the art director might be, well, if the sound designer can get all this freedom, why don't I get this freedom? What happened here? Why is it wrong? Why is it off? Last meeting we had, it was A and now it's B. If there's a lack of clarity, what you get is chaos. And chaos creates 2 things. A, it creates hurt, which is a waste of time. B, it crashes motivation. Nothing is more demoralizing than a lack of clarity. So clarity then becomes the most valuable thing you have because clarity directly leads to motivation, and the most valuable thing you have as a game studio is motivation. If there are 3 things you need to make games, right? You need money or time, you need skill, ability, and you need motivation to make a game. Say we lose one of these 3. Okay, say we have to sacrifice one. Say we have no money. Very motivated, we have the skill. Can we make a video game? Many people did it. Cave Story, one of my favorite games. Poor kid, just worked for 5 years, shipped the game. Awesome game, right? Okay, say we have no skill, but we have tons of money. We have motivation, we want to make a game. Can we make a game? Yeah, easy. Hire some people, make the video game. Okay, you have money, you have skill, you're demotivated. Are you going to make a game? It's not going to happen. The most valuable thing you own, more than anything else, in leading a team is the motivation of your team. And motivation is a currency that is extremely expensive. It's really expensive. And the thing that makes that worse is that very often part of your job as a leader is delivering bad news. Shit, Jeff Keighley emailed, he wants a trailer in 3 days. So we're going to drop all the work We're going to redirect some shit, and we're going to get this done, and we're going to get this trader done. Everybody, whatever you're doing is canceled. We're just going to focus on this. That's pretty demoralizing. Now, if the trader does well, that's great. But if Jeff then emails, actually, I changed my mind, we're not doing the trader. Now you've lost a lot of motivation and you didn't get anything out of it. When I teach game developers to be better leaders, one of the things I have to work with is that most game developers don't really want to be leaders and don't really want to think about being leaders. So I teach them something fairly simple. I call it motivational coins. And it works very, very simple. Everything you do to support a person on your team, whether it's emotionally, whether it's in terms of work, whether you give them clarity, goals, where you create trust, they get a motivational coin. Every time you do something shitty, it costs motivational coins. So changing what somebody is doing, very expensive. Trust me on this. Nothing is more expensive than telling somebody, oh, this thing you're doing, that's great, cut it. We're going that way now. Changing what the game is, what the goals are, what the constraints is a very expensive thing. And it's not just expensive for one person, it's expensive for everybody on the team. Right? What? That was terrifying. I'm sorry. I'm like a squirrel or like a dog sometimes. It's just like it moves. I'm fascinated. That's cool, Gimbal. Anyway, what were we? Motivational coins. I'm terrified. Motivational coins, then, are a very abstract way, very concrete way to think about, okay, how does motivation work? Obviously, what you want is you want to develop sort of the emotional intelligence to be able to feel these things. People's motivation, people's happiness, people's willingness to work should not be measured in coins. But given that very often, if you're having a talk with me about becoming a better leader, you might not have that emotional ability yet, this is a fairly good fallback. When you make a decision, when you talk to somebody, how many coins does it cost? And if it costs a lot of coins, how can we make sure that there are coins to offset that? How can we make sure that we've built the trust, that we've built the reliability, that they're okay with taking a blow to their motivation right now? Because ultimately, leadership then is about decision making. How do we make decisions? How do decisions get made? And I think the very best tip I ever got early in my career, thankfully, on decision making, I'm going to glance at that clock. Oh, that's a very scary clock. On decision making was actually fairly simple. It came down to somebody telling me, listen, if you could do the things that you want to do yourself, you wouldn't hire people to do them better than you. So if you're getting people in a conversation, just listen first, right? So if you have a problem, best thing you can do instead of giving the solution is to just put it in the team. Get the relevant state. Why are you doing this to me? What is happening? Who's in control of the light? Nobody? Can it? I love the spotlight. Can it be slightly lower? Like just dim it a little? I'd love to see the people instead of 14 dots. I literally cannot see you all anymore. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. That's it. That's it. I love you. You're great. Listen before you speak, which is if you have a problem, put it in front of the group and listen to the conversation that happens. Get the relevant people. Remember the RACI chart, the responsible, accountable, consultant, informed? Get the accountable people, the responsible people in a room. Get the consultant people in a room. Listen to them talk. And very often what will happen is from this multidisciplinary mess that is game development will come a number of interesting things. And what you do is you just listen. Don't try to change the conversation. Don't try to push for the solution you have. Your job is to make the best solution possible. And the best solution possible is not going to come from one brain. It's going to come from multiple brains with multiple perspectives on that same situation, looking at it, and then talking together. And very often what will happen is a solution that you didn't even know was a possibility arising from that conversation. That said, with this, don't forget about the hierarchy, right? What you don't want is to create a situation where leadership doesn't feel like they can lead effectively, because every time there is a decision made, you undermine their authority. What I normally do is I will have a conversation, I'll get every stakeholder in the room, but ultimately I will look at the person who's in charge of that decision and go, hey, you've been listening to this. What do you think? What are your feelings? And then I'll throw that back to the room, right? That way we get a conversation where we get to listen to all of the things. There's no interruptions from people who have more power. And then ultimately a decision has to be made. And this is where leadership gets really complicated, because there is what I like to call the terror of choice, which makes me sound like a supervillain. But there is something really scary about choice. In fact, this has been researched. It's not really the fear of choice. Humans have a disproportionate fear of regret. We're terrified of regret. We're terrified of making the wrong choice and then looking back and going, oh my God, I could have made a better choice. In fact, this is so well documented that if you look up some research about this, it's probably one of the strangest reads you'll ever do, because most people will recognize themselves in this, down to like which toothpaste you pick, right? Did I pick the wrong one because this one is anti-caries and this one is for shinier teeth? Did I pick the right one? People fear regret. And they fear regret because there's this idea in leadership and entrepreneurship that there is the best decision, the perfect decision, the decision that would have made everything work. But it's not really about making perfect decisions, because there's not really such a thing as perfect decisions. When it comes down to it, there's really just one decision. There's one decision that matters, which is the decision you make. Which call do you go with? What is the decision you make? All the other decisions stay hypotheticals, of which we will never know the outcome. We will never know how they would have gone because you didn't make that decision. You could switch decision later on, and it still would not have been the same as if you had started with that decision. So whenever you make a choice, that moment is recorded in time, and time will flow from there. And whatever happens, you will never be able to go back on that. Now that is why people are terrified of regretting their choice. That said, there's another idea that I learned that I use a lot in my own leadership, which is there's not a single human in the history of mankind that looked at a choice and then intentionally picked the worst one. That's just not what happens. When people have two choices, they look at the two choices, they go with the one that they think is best at that moment in time. Is that the right choice? Well, we don't know. They will make that choice and there will be an outcome. And maybe in hindsight, you might go, oh, that was the wrong choice, right? Or maybe the other choice would have been better. The importance of that is the version of you that made that choice did not know that yet. So being hard on yourself for having picked the wrong thing there is never going to help, because it's not focused on improving. What you're doing is you're trying to look back in the past and imagining some sort of alternative reality in which you did something else. Nobody benefits from that. You don't, your team doesn't, the game doesn't. What you can do is look at, okay, how did I end up making a choice that now in hindsight I think was not the right choice? And how can I avoid that? And so I don't really believe that there's such a thing as a wrong decision. I do believe that there's such a thing as an uninformed decision. Not gathering the information from your team, not gathering information on the context. Ultimately, though, again, your team benefits from clarity. A leader that is not making a decision is not clarity. So there is a necessity to make decisions. There is a necessity to make a call and to live with the outcome of that call. And then you want to enforce your decisions. And decisions for leadership in games are a little weird because there are lots of different levels of leadership in games. When you're a creative director, a lot of people think that that means that you're... Have you ever seen that meme on the internet of like the person standing over the shoulder of like a 3D modeler and they're moving the toilet like 2 steps to the left and the creative director's like, no, no. And then they move to the right and they're like, no, no, no. That's not creative direction. That's kind of being an asshole. Creative direction is very much about zooming in and zooming out, right? So you can say that toilet is too far to the left. That is 100% a correct assessment. Sitting behind the 3D modeler that's placing the toilet and going, no, it should be to the left, no, actually a little to the right, is not a solution for that problem. The solution for that problem is, why the hell is the 3D modeler putting the toilet in the wrong place? What about our process of communication, of establishing this place, of establishing the rules of this game, has gone wrong that a 3D artist fails at placing the toilet in the place it should be in the first place. So when you're looking as a lead at your team, what I normally do is I look zoomed in. I look for small signs that something is off. A deliverable that's wrong, an artist that delivers an asset that's out of style or out of scope. One of my favorite, artists that deliver too high quality work. Breaks their heart every time, always regret having to do it. But if programmers are very unreliable with timelines, because code is an ass, artists' biggest weakness is whenever you give them even 10 minutes, they will go back and try to polish up old stuff. This is like, it's like a curse. They can't help it. They have all the assets in the game. You're 3 weeks from launch. They have 2 weeks. They're like, oh, can I go back and touch, like, this is not quite, can I improve this, right? The problem with art is that it's very visible, and that if there's something that you have that is so clearly better than the rest, then everything else looks worse by definition. So I very frequently go to my artists and go like, no, listen, can we, that's beautiful. Can we, a little less? Can we like 10% down from here? Just so that it doesn't like stand out as much opposed to everything else. The artists will always go like, can't we just make everything else better? And no, we cannot. We do not have time for that shit. So I look for small things, right? I look for small things, and then what I do instead is when I find a problem, I zoom back out to the highest possible level where we could have prevented this mistake from happening. Was it not clear in the style guide, sort of like what level of fidelity we were going for? Is there not a clear sort of like, this is too much? Did we have a conversation about this? Like, was there not a clear point where we said, okay, no, we've decided this and we're moving on? I try to create a system of one-way doors, which means they're clear decision-making moments. I use the phrase one-way doors from airports because I travel a lot. If I go out an airport, there's always the moment where you have to go through the sliding doors or like the double opening doors. And there's always a message that says, if you go through these doors, you cannot go back. If you've ever done an international flight, you have seen these doors. If you go through those doors, the reason you can't go back is now you're no longer secure. So if you want to go through, you have to go through immigration, you have to go through security, they have to make sure you're not a threat to the airplane or the people within the airport. So that's the air side, and then there's the land side. As soon as you go through those doors, you pass from air side to land side, and you can no longer go back. The nice thing about the one-way doors is almost everybody who flies will have a moment while they're going through the doors where they check if they have their wallet and their phone, if they didn't leave it on the airplane. Most people do it subconsciously, but if you just stand there for 10 minutes, there's a toilet near the Amsterdam one-way doors. If you stand there for 10 minutes waiting for somebody, you will see almost everybody go before they go through the doors. I want that in my game development process. I want those one-way doors. I want that moment where everybody kind of checks, are we okay? Do we have everything? Are we clear on our goals? Are we clear on our constraints? Are we all aligned? And if not, how do we make sure that we are, right? And again, we try to do this in the discipline of the people that are there. So from art, I don't want a document. I don't want a fucking document from art. There might be a style guide, but the thing I want from art, mock-ups, examples, render targets, like implementation of what a 3D asset looks like. I want them to have worked with tech to make sure that's viable. I want all that information. That's a one-way door. We all agreed on this? Yes, okay. Let's document that. Let's say, okay, at this point in this meeting, we agreed that this thing here, that's what we're doing. So that if anybody in the future says, I wasn't clear on that, you can just point to that document and say, no, we were. We were agreed on this. So you want to get buy-in by getting everybody in a room, everybody agreeing, and then you want to document your buy-in. Like I was saying before, when there are issues, that's a drone. When there are issues, ooh, that's a tree. Ooh, okay. They dodged it, don't worry. That's a risky flyer, flying backwards towards the tree, okay. If you see a fault, an error, don't fix the fault. Fix the reason the fault could occur. That is a way more useful use of your time. And then yes, obviously you also want to fix the fault. But a better way of fixing the 3D artist with the toilet is, instead of being the creative director standing over the back, is go talk to the art director and figure out what the hell went wrong. They can fix the toilet, don't worry. And then one topic I want to talk about real quick is dealing with power. Because leadership does give power. Actually, this stage gives power. Like, just standing up here makes me sound way smarter than I am in real life. Just because you gave me a mic and a stage, right? The same is true with any leadership position. If you are the art director, and you go in and you tell everybody in a meeting, like, okay, you know what? We're all equals here. Let's have a chat. Anyway, I think it should be red. Good luck to whoever thought it should be green. Right? Because now you have to go against the person who has the power to fire you. The best way I've heard this explained was called a robot suit. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of this one, but I thought this was brilliant. It basically goes as follows. Everybody in any organization has a robot suit. The amount of power, and it's like one of those cool Power Rangers robot suits, you know, like a Megazord or something. And the cool thing about the Megazords is they always had a cockpit in their chest, but from that, it always looked like they were, because probably video issues, it always looked like they were looking the opponent in the eyes. So from the Megazord, everybody always looked same size. This is how your robot suit works. Your power is a robot suit, and from your eyes, everybody looks like they're the same size as your suit. Doesn't matter how big their suit is, it's just the way the camera works. Everybody looks like they have your size robot suit. Now, that's not a problem if you have a similarly sized robot suit. You're just talking eye to eye. But if you are the boss of a company, and you go to a junior and you say, hey, you should do this, just a suggestion, you have to understand that from their perspective, they're in a tiny-ass Lego robot suit, and you're Voltron. You're like skyscraper sized. And they will look at that and go, well, I guess I better do that. Right? This shines through in everything. When you are a lead, it is very important to understand that you have power. And that power changes the way people interact with you, want to interact with you, or feel comfortable interacting with you. It means that things you say carry more weight, even if you say they should not. One of my favorite examples from this actually comes from Islam. I was raised Muslim. And in Islam, there's this idea that nobody knows the truth of how things should be but God, Allah. So there's a phrase that is Allahu A'lam, and it means only Allah knows. And religious scholars will use the phrase when answering a question. So they'll say, this is what I think, but Allahu A'lam. Only Allah knows the truth of that. The problem with that is eventually saying Allahu A'lam became a signifier of being a scholar in religion. So people started thinking that if you said Allahu A'lam, I should probably listen to you more. This is how leadership works. Even if you tell people, don't listen to me, the fact that you have the suit will make people listen to you. Even if they don't want to, even if they disagree. So if you're asking for somebody's opinion, be aware of the suit. If you're asking for people to agree or disagree with something, to sign off on something, to consent to something, to be part of an idea, you have to be aware of the size of your robot suit. And if you are not, what you're going to do is you're going to create situations where you think people agree with you, but behind you, they're all going like, oh, the lead sucks. Yeah, it just keeps giving us ideas and then going like, yeah, sure, you agree with it, right? Like, if any of you work for a boss, I'm sure you've worked for a boss where you look at it and they always went like, oh, yeah, we'll do that. That's a great idea. You're like, that wasn't my idea. You told me that, right? That boss always exists. Don't be that one. Ultimately, this whole thing, this whole exercise comes down to trust. Oh, shit. Trust and empathy. And trust is one of those weird ones because clarity creates trust. Being aware of power dynamics creates trust. The hierarchy creates trust. Reliability creates trust. All of these things create trust. Developing trust is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. And here's the thing I've realized about trust. If you have trust, it's really easy to hold trust. If somebody trusts you and you don't screw them over, it's really easy to hold people's trust. Just don't screw up. They'll give you the benefit of the doubt, right? If you screw up. Losing trust, though, is very easy. You only need to hurt somebody once to lose their trust. You only have to create one situation where they feel unheard, misunderstood, not listened to, and you lose that trust. So holding trust is easy. Losing trust is easy. What is really hard is rebuilding trust. Building trust is not even that hard. Rebuilding trust, trust lost, returning that is incredibly hard. So when it comes to leadership, I think the main things that I want to sort of emphasize one more time is that ultimately this entire talk comes down to this slide. Trust. Everything we've talked about comes down to trust. The most valuable thing you have as a lead is trust. And you get trust from your clarity, from reliability, and from processes, from being the person that people think you are, from being the person that makes sure that the team delivers the best thing they are. It is not a place of power. It is not a place of fame. It is not a place of any of that. If you want to figure out how to lead your team a little better and you have questions, I don't know if we have time for questions, but if you have any questions, I think we'll take them now. Looking a little scared. We'll take them now. Awesome.
Yeah, we have like some time for questions, 1 or 2. So please raise your hands and you'll take the mic.
Any questions? There is one.
On the way.
Hello, great
Hi.
talk, thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about the hierarchical, a mouthful, structure between the production manager and the creative lead that you mentioned in the beginning.
And what would you like to ask about that?
For example, if they have a disagreement and none of them budge, what's the resolution steps?
Well, this is why hierarchy is so important. But in hierarchy, I also mentioned the other word, which is responsibility, right? So what you do is the RACI chart, why I use that as an example, is because it's very clear. There can always only be one person that's accountable for any decision. So if your creative and production are disagreeing, my first question would be, what are they disagreeing about? Are they disagreeing about a creative decision? Then genuinely, with all due respect, I don't really give a shit about what the production says. I need a creative decision. But if that decision has production influences, then I want to know what the production lead thinks of it. So again, like I think of them as opposite forces. The creative director is always pushing for more, and the production person is the constraint. So if the producer wants to say, hey, I don't think that's cool, that's great, but that's not what I hired them for. I'd love to hear their opinion, but ultimately I want the creative director's call. If the producer says, okay, here's a feature, I don't think we have time for it, let me look, no, actually, we don't have time to prototype this, that's a production call. So then I would like the producer to make that call. Similarly, if this was across disciplines, for example, art, programming, whatever, I tend to like to involve people in these meetings. If some lead engineers like being part of art discussions, right? So I'll bring them in, and if they have an opinion, I respect that. I love that. But if there's a discussion between my programmer and my art director on an art thing, ultimately, it's the art director's call, and I will stand by my art director, because that's why I hired them to be an art director. If the programming lead says, listen, I love this art style, but I can't implement it with the time or with the resources we have, that's a programming call. So it's really the question that becomes who should be making this call. And for leads, this is where it becomes really tricky. For that specific situation, creative production, the biggest risk that you have in that system is that they don't agree which decision this is. Is this a creative decision or is this a production position? If they get stuck over that for more than a few days, they're just terrible leads. Like that ultimately they should make a call in the best interest of the game. For me, if we are in pre-production, that'll go to the creative. If we're past pre-production, it'll go to the producer. That's how I do it for myself, because I'm usually producer on most projects. So if we're in production, my call goes. Like that I don't want to, and I tell my creative director that before we go into production, right? If we're in the pre-pro phase, I'll shut up. I gave them a deadline, like that's the deadline. At that point I want a game, and if like a month from there we don't have a game yet, then I'm gonna have some words, but otherwise it shouldn't be my call at that point. That's the creative part of game development. So I would say your best option here is to just have a chat between these two forces beforehand to figure out whose responsibility is what.
Thank you.
Cool.